I did my favorite Robot Masters list, so now it's time for my least favorite. Or most hated, for impact. Truth be told, quite a few of the classic games have rosters where I like every single member, but rather than be wishy-washy and start saying stuff like, well, since I have to choose, I'm going to try and do this entire list like every entry is a boss that has personally slighted me, and my only recourse is to get somebody to mod him out of the game. With that in mind, maybe some of you can pick out which ones I'm putting in just because I have to and which ones I truly do wish had never been sketched out. With the rules set, I'm Wes, the Explosion, and here's the Robot Master I despise most from all of the mainline classic games. With a few bonus categories. Low-hanging fruit, but for the original game, it's Bomb Man. His weapon, the Hyper Bomb, is just so awkward to use, you tossing it out, it skidding a bit, then finally blowing up a second or so later, so they're not terribly reliable. Especially against something that's not going to stand still. And then there's his appearance. I get that the main part of his body seems to be a large black ball, like cartoon bombs, and the mohawk is fine, I guess, but somehow, he just looks kind of odd. I'm also not a fan of the yellow and orange palette, and for some reason, I think he has a tail, which seems kinda slapped on. Is that a Ruby Spears thing? They also gave him a beak in the cartoon, which didn't look horrible, but still, I see Bomb Man, and I wonder what I'm looking at and why I'm looking at. I just don't like him. And as an honorable mention? Probably not the right term for it, but here's Oil Man from Powered Up. And here's how he originally looked in the Japanese version. Not gonna comment too much on his appearance, all I'm gonna say is, darn it Capcom, you made things really awkward around the dinner table that Thanksgiving. In Mega Man 2, I hate trying to use the atomic fire. It's the first chargeable weapon, but that function of it never seems to work. Sometimes it won't make the proper sound to indicate it's powering up, sometimes it will but still sends out the basic shot, and trying to make use of it tends to be actively detrimental, so I kinda resent Heatman for giving it to me. The guy actually has some decent attacks, so I'm not sure why he gives the failed Mega Buster attempt instead. Then when you fight his Doc Robot in the following game, he gets a lot quicker and more erratic with the fire towers he flings about, so that dodging them feels nigh impossible a lot of the time. I really hate fighting him, but maybe it's unfair to hold him accountable for what his Doc Doppelganger does. Then again, he had to learn from somewhere, so maybe not. Plus, he once made fun of my shirt, and even though he did apologize, I've never really forgiven him. I always feel weird fighting Sparkman in 3. He has no hands, and while most official artwork has him looking pretty put together, when I see his actual sprite, it seems to me like he's lacking skin and some facial aspects. Like his mouth. He just looks very incomplete, and when I go into his boss room, it feels like I'm walking in on someone naked, which is very uncool. Add to that his weapon being pretty lackluster, and yeah, if one had to go, just cover up a bit, man. I'm not body shaming, I just don't think kids should be exposed to nudity. Or body horror. Whichever this is. Crash Man's pretty cool, right? He's small and sleek, and despite suffering from the no-hand thing, he's got these nifty little drills that latch onto things and then explode. They're actually pretty handy for harassing people in Smash Bros. Too. So why they decided to redo Crash in 4 while making him big and clunky is completely beyond me. 4 has a pretty strong roster in terms of design, but Drillman is the only one that doesn't stand out to me. I was originally going to force myself to give this slot to Dustman, due to all those iframes, until I remembered that this booger exists, and he's the only one on this list to get me to do that. I guess he manages to get in due to the only thing worse than hatred, indifference. Oh, and I don't get how his digging cycle works. He just goes underground and then seems to randomly pop up sometime later. Normally I just keep running around and manage to avoid him, so it's not a problem, but darn it, if there's a pattern, I want to know. Mega Man 5 has some very detailed and creative bosses. And also apparently a budget on that creativity, because it also has some of the least inspired in the series. Bottom of that list might just be Starman, a man with stars pasted on his body. And that's pretty much it! No wait, he also has a buster that I don't even remember if he uses. If you look at some of the more detailed official art, he looks a little better, but going from 2 discernible stars to 6 ain't much better. I know this guy has some fans, but I honestly don't understand it. There's so much you can do with space and stars, and they somehow managed to find the most boring possibility. If we ever get a Mega Man 12, I just pray we never see a Circle Man. In 6, Centaur Man is kind of annoying to fight. He disappears and reappears, sometimes right on top of you, and he also freezes you in place from time to time, so if you're in a bad position, there's no dodging his follow-up attack. Between both of these things, he's the boss that seems the most interested in wasting your time, which can make his fight a bit frustrating. Also, a centaur is part man, part horse, so what the heck is a centaur man? Is he 1/4 horse and 3/4 man? I get that you have a motif for boss names, but darn it, words have weight, and you need to think about the implication of these sorts of things. Junk Man is trash, and that's not a metaphor. In Mega Man 7, Wily made a robot out of cobbled together parts and had him take over a waste disposal plant. I appreciate the Frankenstein aesthetic that they seem to be going for, and honestly, if you look at official artwork, the design is passable, but when it comes to his in-game sprite, he just looks terrible. I think the worst thing about it is that he was a boss in 7, which has some of the most vibrant and, my opinion, best looking sprite work in the entire series. So while he might have looked alright in any other entry, the fact that he takes up a slot on the roster here is pretty darn inexcusable. And while he doesn't exactly get Spark mandrilled, if you go up against him with his weakness, it is pretty darn pathetic. Search Man from 8 has 2 heads. And that's the only thing I find interesting about him. The rest of his body is pretty basic, with just a bazooka replacing one of his arms and a camo paint job slapped on top. Try looking at the original boss design submitted by a fan sometime, and you'll see that he originally had a lot of fun little details in his design, and while a few were a little much, they really didn't need to strip him down as much as they did. As it stands, he could easily be confused for just a regular stage enemy and doesn't stand out next to the other 7 from this roster. The fight against him is also kinda chaotic, him throwing out projectiles while I just madly swing my flame sword, hoping to find the right bush. A lot of times, I just blank out for a minute and a half, and when I come to, one of us is dead. Typically him. You would think my hatred of Ground Man from Mega Man and Bass would come from his similarities to Drill Man, but no, it's what he has in common with Wheel Gator that makes me despise him. Another boss that can just hide so that you don't have a chance to attack him for prolonged periods of time, taking cheap shots at you while he does so. Rather than buzzsaws or just sharing Gator and Drill's habit of trying to pop out from under you though, he summons a giant frickin' 3-pronged drill to try and scramble you with, which, given its size, also has a very large hitbox, which is bad for you. And since this is the game where pretty much everything can tank a billion hits, there's no real fast way to take him out. Using his weakness, the remote mines will make the fight go from taking an excruciating amount of time to a still kind of unreasonable length. Listen guys, I get it. I love Guts Man, you love Guts Man, we all love Guts Man. But do we need to keep recycling his design? Seriously, besides the original, we previously have 3 other Guts Men, and then 9 decides to have Construction Worker Guts Man, named Concrete Man. This game has so many robot masters that feel unique and fresh, and then we get a reskin, which is a little underwhelming. He also occupies a weird spot in my difficulty rating, since when I was a teen, I swear that I wasn't able to dodge his concrete blocks without sliding, which was absent from that game. And now when I play, it's really easy to get around him with minimal, maybe no damage, so in my mind, he's simultaneously cheap and a pushover. A lot of the bosses from 10 are really boring in my opinion. Just regular objects made vaguely humanoid, and Commando Man kind of takes the uninspired cake. Rather than an old-fashioned water pump or baseball, he seems to be made out of random boxes pulled from a munitions depot, with 2 vaguely cannon-like orifices at the end of what can only generously be called arms, and with a green paint job splashed over the whole thing. I know I criticized Search Man for his camo, but here, that would have at least been enough to put Commando over 1 or 2 of his compatriots. When I look at him, I just don't want to acknowledge him as a robot master. Impact Man from 11 is a jerk. When he activates his double gear, he gets really big and causes you to stumble when he hits the ground, so it can be really hard to deal with it without taking some damage. Of course, with a few properly placed charged power gear shots, he goes down pretty easy, and the rest of his attacks aren't too hard to get around, so he's overall kind of a meh boss. His level though, that's what really gets my goat. Him constantly popping in at points to take cheap swings at you without fear of repercussions, like a total coward and bully. At first, you can pretty easily keep ahead of him. Heck, running straight and sliding a bunch is typically enough to keep you out of his trajectory, but later in the level, it becomes total bull. Climbing upwards on a moving platform, you have very little maneuvering room, so when his 3 parts start flying at you, one right after the other, it's tough enough to dodge just one attack, and I at least normally get hit with a follow-up. If he knocks you off, you're likely to land in some spikes and have to immediately jump onto another platform before your iframes wear off. No time to pause and assess your situation. He manages to make his stage absolutely no fun. Perhaps the only one in the game where there's no point when I'm enjoying myself, just knowing that I'll soon be at the mercy of this absolute tool. The only joy I get is landing the final hit to kill him. Or it would be if Dr. Light didn't repair him later. Please, Doc, just this one. For the special Rockman World bosses, I'm going with the only one that's not a member of the Mega Man Killers. Congratulations, guys! Instead, it's the wannabe Quinn. Bad guys that are just the main character but evil tend to be not the most creative villains, but if executed well, they can work. A kidnapped and reprogrammed version of them from the future, though, does not. Adding time travel has to be done very carefully to not overcomplicate or just make a continuity stupid, and a paragraph in an instruction manual is not deeply nuanced. I would think about the possible implications this has in universe and the existential crisis this has to give Mega Man, but this is so dumb that a lot of the time, I just repress that it ever happened. And is canon, since Quinn appears in other games besides World 2. Sweet Christmas, as someone who loves video game lore, I absolutely despise this. As for his fight, he just kinda hops around on his pogo stick and you just shoot him in the back of the head till he dies. Then you get the pogo and it either sucks so much or I just don't understand how to use it and you take damage when jumping on enemies with it. Thanks for nothing, I guess. Other than a headache. I've only played through Rockman World 5 once, but out of the Stardroids, Mars didn't leave much of an impression. From what I remember, Poor Man's Napalm Man just kinda shot missiles while I tried to dodge and do more damage to him than he did me. The rest of the Stardroids all have such cool designs and fights that required a bit of skill to manage, so this action figure colored weirdo with 2 gun arms and a head phallus really did not impress. Can I return him for a planet from another galaxy? My pick for Fortress Boss is not the Boo Beam, surprisingly, which should really tell you something. The King Tank from Mega Man and Bass might just be my least favorite, no, scratch that, most hated fight in any of the classic games. It has 4 parts you need to take out. You can only attack them as they attack you, and waiting to strike one piece in particular could leave you vulnerable to the moves of another. It's a fight where the opponent completely controls the pace, and, like I mentioned with Ground Man, everything in this game takes a ridiculous amount of damage, so it's really drawn out. And since I've been hung up on appearance, it's also really boring to look at, and the King Stage boss music is a short loop of perhaps the most painful video game music I've ever heard. If I were cursed to listen to it ad nauseum for the rest of my life, I'd throw myself off a cliff. For Wily Machines, I have 2 contenders, but rather than whine about bullcrap, I think I'll go with the boring option instead, the one from the original game. I always complain about how so many of these feel interchangeable, just being a hovering vehicle with a large skull, but this one doesn't even get that skeletal flair. It's just kind of a generic sci-fi vehicle that moves back and forth, throwing out small projectiles in a parabola, then moves back and forth with an exposed cockpit, firing bigger projectiles at a diagonal. It looks more like concept art than a final design, and while I remember the weaknesses are Rolling Cutter and Firestorm, I don't remember which part gets which, and probably would forget entirely if the weapon roster wasn't so small in this one. It is the first game, so I guess it's fine. I should probably just look at it as proof for how far the series went after that, by immediately lowering my standards. If there's one thing that this list has taught me, it's that I'm a superficial jerk. The most common factor seems to be whether I find the boss boring looking, or in a few cases, ugly. Which is mean. I am very mean. But hey, like I said at the beginning, there's only a few here that I actually hate, which may or may not have been obvious, though I tried my best to be as sarcastic and nasty as possible, just to test it out and try to keep the video from sounding tepid. How'd I do? Anyone greatly offended? Was this one a mistake? And what are your own least favorites from the classic series? As always, thanks for watching, and maybe consider subscribing if you enjoy Mega Man content. For everlasting peace, I say after just throwing a ton of shade.